I thought the 2004 Nimitz case was the best example of radar data visual acquisition by pilots and then any sort of signals. As we saw, there could be jamming. But I didn't know about the Rb-47 case. Can't believe I didn't know about this case. Did you know we have captured signals from UFOs and it's still classified as an unknown? The Rb-47 case is an amazing case from a bomber, pre-B-52 bomber converted to a spy plane reconnaissance aircraft that was followed by interesting lights and detected with their elint equipment. So their special equipment designed to track and pick up enemy systems picked up a signal from this object, co-located its location, and matched its airborne radar. So that is just amazing to me that we have visual confirmation, elint data from this UFO, as well as matching ground and airborne radar. Just an extremely interesting case, still filed as unknown. Thanks for being here.
Chris Lehto, welcome to LehtoFiles.
The Boeing B-47 Stratojet is a retired American long-range six-engine turbojet-powered strategic bomber. Look at that six-engine setup. So interesting. Designed to fly at high subsonic speed. So it wasn't supersonic, but it flew at high altitude to avoid enemy interceptor aircraft. The primary mission of the B-47 was as a nuclear bomber capable of striking targets within the Soviet Union. It was developed in 1943 for a reconnaissance bomber that harnessed newly developed jet propulsion. Another key innovation adopted during the development process was the swept wing that came from captured German research. Its engines carried in nacelles underneath the wing. That was another innovation. It was a major post-World War II combat jet design and contributed to the development of modern jet airliners. In 1951, the B-47 entered operational service with the United States Air Force's Strategic Air Command, with SAC becoming a mainstay of its bomber force by the late 1950s. That's when this sighting actually occurred, was in 1957. Over 2,000 were manufactured to meet the Air Force's demands due to the tensions of the Cold War. It was in service until 1965, at which point it was supplanted by the more capable Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. The B-47 was adapted to perform other roles such as photographic reconnaissance and electronic intelligence, ELINT, which is what this plane was actually doing on July 17th, 1957, when it was followed by a UFO. It's such a crazy design as well. So the Rb-47H carried a crew of 6 with the pilot, co-pilot, and navigator up in the pressurized section of the nose. The 3 electronic warfare officers, or EWOs, also known as Ravens or Crows, were stationed in the bomb bay of a normal B-47, facing backwards. Look at that. On typical missions, the EWOs spent about 12 to 14 hours working in this confined, windowless compartment, completely surrounded by electronic equipment. How'd you like to be one of those guys? The Rb-47H carried electronic countermeasures equipment and electronic sensors and radomes in several locations in the nose, under the front and rear of the fuselage. These are your little ELINT detectors. Under the wingtips, there's some more there. And on some later Rb-48Hs, like the one pictured here, in a pod attached to the right side of the fuselage. This case is also interesting to me because I was an electronic attack officer in the aggressors. And that's what we did, is actually look at ELINT from adversaries. You can guess probably who. ELINT, you're just soaking up trons. So you're not sending anything out. That's just you're recording what's out there, which is quite interesting that they recorded the signal from this UFO. Also interesting is an Rb-47H was shot down 2 months after Gary Francis Powers was shot down in his U-2, if you remember that. On July 1st, 1960, a Strategic Air Command Rb-47H crew was flying in international airspace that was actually later confirmed it was in international airspace over the Arctic north of the USSR when a Soviet MiG-19 fighter began to shadow their aircraft. Without provocation, they say, the MiG pilot attacked. Despite returning fire, the Rb-47H was shot down and 4 of the 6 crewmen were killed. The navigator, McCone, and the co-pilot ejected from the aircraft and were picked up by a Soviet trawler. They were flown to Moscow and became guests of the KGB in the dreaded Lubyanka prison. In addition to many interrogation sessions, McCone and Olmsted faced possible execution for espionage. Fortunately, after 7 months of imprisonment, the Soviets did not bring them to trial, and both were released in January 1961 when Kennedy took office. Super interesting. I did not know that. So on July 17, 1957, an Air Force Rb-47, equipped with electronic countermeasure gear and manned by 6 officers, was followed by an unidentified object for a distance of well over 700 miles. And for a time period of 1.5 hours, 1.5 hours, as it flew from Mississippi through Louisiana and Texas and into Oklahoma. The object was at various times seen visually by the cockpit crew as an intensely luminous light, white, sometimes red. It was also followed by ground radar. It was noted by the airborne radar on the aircraft as well. And it was detected on the ECM monitoring gear. So that elint, that special equipment designed to pick up enemy systems, also picked it up. This information comes from UFOevidence.org, an amazing website. This is actually the route of flight of the aircraft past Jackson towards Dallas. Again, the ground radar does pick it up. We'll go through it in a second. All the way up to Oklahoma City, back to Forbes Air Force Base. Look at that, 400 miles. So it was tracked, followed for 700 miles in an hour and a half. The Rb-47 case is the first known case of a UFO transmitting its own radar beam. So there are several other cases now known, but this was the first one to become public. So not only was the UFO tracked by an air defense radar on the ground near Dallas and by the Rb-47 spy plane's airborne radar, but the UFO itself was sending out radar signals around 3 gigahertz. It's the only known radar visual elint case on record. So that's the only one known. The Rb-47 on July 17, 1957 flew out of Forbes Air Force Base in Kansas on a training mission out over the Gulf of Mexico. On its return leg, so coming back in from the ocean, the UFO was detected on the spy plane's elint gear. The crew consisted of 6 people. Lewis Chase was the pilot. He had a co-pilot and a navigator up in the front with him. And then there were 3 EWOs in the back. Number 1 monitor, number 2 monitor, and number 3 monitor. This particular mission began as an exercise, including gunnery exercises over the Texas Gulf area. So they had guns on it, I guess. They can return fire, I said before. Then it was navigation exercises over the open Gulf, so over the water. And then electronic countermeasure exercises on the return trip across the south central US. So that's when they're actually looking into the ECM system. The crew participating were soon to depart for Germany and go to duty there. This is at the height of the Cold War, remember, in 1957. And remember that ECM equipment is not radar, okay? It's the receiver only. So it receives the signals. That means it can be very sensitive. And really it's to record enemy systems. They would fly near Russia and try and see if they could detect, copy, and steal their ground radar systems, try and defeat them later on. So that was the whole point, was to detect and locate enemy radar installations. So enemy systems on the ground, which are usually down at that 3 gigahertz. The number 2 monitor consisted of a direction finder with an antenna on the lower rear of the aircraft. So in here, it's got a direction finder. The number 1 monitor consisted of a direction finder with antennas on each wingtip of the aircraft. So going to be out wider, gives you a better idea where the signal is coming from. And the number 3 monitor was not involved on these events on July 17th because its frequencies were not involved. So it's probably the frequencies were up higher, at least not were around 3 gigahertz. The first contact with the unknown object was before 4 a.m. Central Standard Time. The first two parts of the mission had been completed, and the aircraft was just leaving the airspace over the Gulf of Mexico near Gulfport, Mississippi, when Frank McClure on the number 2 ECM monitor detected an airborne signal to the right rear of the aircraft out over the Gulf of Mexico. The signal was of a type usually confined to ground-based radar installations. It was at 2.8 gigahertz, a common frequency for S-band search radar. This is interesting to me because it's actually ground-based radar signals. Normally, fighter radar signals are up near 9 gigahertz, so quite a bit higher. Why is that? It's so you can have a much smaller antenna. So you can have a smaller transmitter and receiver. Normally, the ground-based systems are much larger, so they can have lower band. They can go down to 3 gigahertz and less. So that'll be your normal SAM systems. So I imagine when they first saw this, consider it some sort of ground-based signal being sent up, maybe something else they're confused with their own systems. So McClure at first thought that his scope must be 180 degrees out of alignment. He must be picking up a ground-based radar station in Louisiana, so off the nose of the aircraft, not out of the ocean. So he thought he must be 180 degrees out. So that would actually be to the left front of the aircraft. But as he watched, the signal moved up the scope, as it would if the scope was 180 degrees out of alignment. However, he was amazed to see that after it moved up the scope on the right-hand side of the aircraft, it then crossed the path of the Rb-47 and proceeded to move down the scope on the left-hand side. In other words, whatever was emitting the signal flew a ring around the Rb-47, which was flying at approximately 500 miles per hour. So even if the scope was 180 degrees out of alignment, the signal source still moved completely around the aircraft, which obviously no ground radar could do. The plane didn't turn or maneuver. McClure said and did nothing at this time, so he didn't mention any of this to the other crew members. He just kept his mouth shut, and then the signal faded as they flew north. The Rb-47 made a scheduled turn to the west over Jackson, Mississippi, and the crew was preparing to begin a series of simulated ECM operations against Air Force ground units. So they're basically practicing against already pre-planned radar ground units when suddenly the pilot, Lewis Jackson, saw a light coming in from the left at approximately the same altitude as the Rb-47. At first he thought it was another plane, but it was only a single white light, closing fast. He gave the command to prepare for evasive maneuvers, but the light flashed across from left to right so fast that no action could even be taken. It then just blinked out at a point to the right front of the aircraft. Both Chase and co-pilot James McCoy observed this, so they both saw it in the front. At this point, approximately 4:10 a.m. Central Standard Time, they were over Winsboro, Louisiana. Chase told the other crew members what he had seen, and McClure now told him about his earlier signal reading. So since that came up, McClure said, "Hey, I saw this crazy ECM reading actually circling our aircraft." At 4:30 a.m., McClure set his scope to detect signals near 3 gigahertz again. And then he detected a strong signal at the same location in relation to the Rb-47 that Chase had last seen the light. McClure and the other ECM monitor, the other EWO Provenzano, checked the alignment of the number 2 monitor by tuning it on known ground radar installations and found it to be in perfect working order. I think that part's really critical, actually, because you could just say this is a system malfunction. Obviously, the systems are just picking up erroneous signals. Something's wrong with the actual electronic equipment. But these are professionals, right? And so they actually tuned it to known ground radar stations and checked it and said everything is working fine. Like the direction finding equipment is working perfectly normal. So everything was working as advertised. So at 4:30 a.m., Provenzano tuned his own monitor, number 1, to 3 gigahertz and found that his equipment detected a signal at the same location again. What's more, he and McClure found that the signal was staying in the same position, keeping pace with the Rb-47, which was still flying at 500 miles per hour. This meant it was not a signal from a ground radar. By this time, they'd reached the Duncanville, Texas area. At 4:39, Chase spotted a huge light to the right front of the Rb-47, about 5,000 feet below the aircraft's 34,500 feet altitude. The weather was perfectly clear. At 4:40, McClure reported two signals at 40 degrees and 70 degrees off. Chase and McCoy reported seeing red lights at those locations, so they matched the actual locations of what they're seeing. Chase contacted radar station Utah at Duncanville, Texas, and requested permission to abandon his flight plan and pursue the lights, which he received. So he's actually going to go and try and track down these lights, fly towards them. At 4:48 a.m., radar station Utah requested the position of the signals that McClure was receiving, and they immediately confirmed that their radar had also detected the objects at the same location. As the Rb-47 attempted to pursue, the object appeared to stop suddenly. So it eventually just stopped. Chase could see they were gaining on it, and then they overshot it. At 4:52, it blinked out and simultaneously vanished from McClure's scope and the ground radar at the same time. Just amazing. Chase put the aircraft into a port turn, and the object suddenly blinked on again, simultaneously reappearing on McClure's scope and the ground radar at 4:52. They began to close to within 5 miles of the object, really when you can see something pretty clearly visually, when it suddenly dropped to 15,000 feet and then blinked out again. Once again, vanishing from the scopes in the aircraft and the ground radar. At 4:55, Chase radioed Utah radar station that they had to break up pursuit and continue with their scheduled flight plan due to low fuel. At 4:57, McClure picked up the signal again, and at 4:58, Chase made visual contact again. So again, you have picking up the signal with the ECM equipment and picking it up visually, the same location. As they headed into Oklahoma, McClure continued to receive a signal, now from the rear of the aircraft, until it finally faded as they neared Oklahoma City. The Director of Intelligence, 55th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing, stated in his report that he had no doubt the electronic direction findings coincided exactly with visual observations by aircraft commander numerous times, thus indicating positively the object being the signal source. So that was the Director of Intelligence at the wing stating that the actual ECM observations, the direction finding equipment, which they confirmed was working perfectly fine, matched this object on numerous occasions and matched exactly what they were seeing visually with their eyes. So they're basically seeing a light, a white light, sometimes red, and then they're matching it with the ECM equipment, the direction finding equipment that this aircraft is designed to actually locate and identify. It's interesting, though, it's designed to locate ground systems in that 3 gigahertz range, but this was in the air. So what can be detected on ECM direction finding devices? Airborne radar can be seen visually and can be detected on ordinary ground-based radar all at the same time. They show it blinking in, blinking out. It's also detected by all the sensors and fly literal rings around a jet traveling at 500 miles per hour. Nothing I know of can do that. Project Blue Book investigated, and they said that the sightings in Dallas-Fort Worth were an ordinary jet airliner, which is amazing to me. But they couldn't explain the abrupt simultaneous disappearance and reappearance of the object from the radar screens, the ECM scopes, and visual detection. So how can they explain that all at the same time? They also couldn't explain the events that occurred over Mississippi and Louisiana. It's also strange that Utah radar station couldn't tell an airliner from an unknown. The Condon Committee toyed with several explanations, but they found also none to be satisfactory, finally classifying this case as unknown. So this is just an amazing case from almost 70 years ago, where we had visual confirmation, ECM, direction finding equipment matching it, as well as airborne radar tracking the object, as well as ground-based radar tracking the object, doing amazing things that you can't do. It would just stop. So it stopped in midair as the jet overflew it. It dropped 15,000 feet, and then they had it blinking on and blinking off. Remember, they tested all the equipment. It was working fine and still had this amazing sighting. Can't believe I hadn't heard of this case. Such an unbelievable case. It just shows the military must have more information on this. What further went on is the actual elint from this aircraft was looked at, analyzed, but then miraculously disappeared. So again, no hard data from the elint because it just miraculously disappeared, as all this stuff somehow happens to do. My question is, what about all the information from the Nimitz? Where's all the information from that case? It seems to mirror this, where you have actual visual tracking, you have ground-based radar picking this stuff up, as well as possible radar jamming off of the actual object in the case of the FLIR 1 video. But still, what you guys think of this case? I thought it was miraculous, amazing to have all these different credible witnesses and matching multiple sensors at the same time from the ground, from the air, and from pilots. I also thought it was interesting. It's in the 3 gigahertz range. It's actually 2.8 to 3 gigahertz is what they were seeing it at, which is normally your ground-based radar. I don't even know if they had any airborne radar at that time that could transmit at that frequency range. So amazing case. Thanks for watching. Please hit the like button. It really helps. Subscribe to get future videos like this as well as others. And you want to support the channel and get exclusive background content, go to patreon.com/chrislehto. You can click this little button right here, or links are in the description. You can also become a YouTube member. Have a great rest of your day. Peace.